They say money talks, but sometimes it screams. My wealthy stepfather Richard Hayes was the kind of man who believed his bank account could solve any problem, silence any voice, buy any outcome he desired. For 3 years, I watched him write checks like they were love letters: $60,000 for my stepsister Emma's Harvard tuition, $50,000 for her spring break in Europe, $20,000 for a car she'd driven maybe a dozen times. I used to think it was favoritism. I used to think Emma was just the golden child, the biological daughter who deserved everything while I, the stepchild, deserved scraps. I spent sleepless nights wondering what was wrong with me, why I wasn't worthy of the same generosity, why I had to work 2 jobs just to afford textbooks while Emma got handed everything on a silver platter. But money has a way of leaving trails, breadcrumbs that lead to the truth. And when I followed those breadcrumbs, when I discovered what Richard was really purchasing with all those generous payments, I realized that Emma wasn't the lucky one. She was the victim. And I was about to become the one thing Richard's money couldn't buy, the voice that would bring his entire world crashing down. You see, Richard always said money could buy anything. He was wrong. It couldn't buy my silence. And that mistake, that arrogant assumption that everyone had a price, would cost him everything he'd ever built, everything he'd ever owned, and ultimately everything he'd ever been. This is the story of how a man's greed became his downfall, how his weapon became his victim's shield, and how the very system he created to control us became the tool of his destruction. This is the story of what happens when someone finally discovers that some things in this world are not for sale. My wealthy stepfather always said money could buy anything. He paid for my stepsister's Harvard tuition without blinking. But when I discovered what he was really buying with those payments, I realized there was one thing his money couldn't purchase: my silence. And that mistake would cost him everything. Before we dive into this story that will leave you questioning everything, hit that like button if you're ready for a tale of secrets, betrayal, and ultimate karma. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this unfolds. 3 years ago, my world changed forever when my mother married Richard Hayes. I was 16 then, still raw from losing my father in a car accident 2 years earlier. Richard swooped into our lives like some kind of savior, promising to take care of us, to give us the life my dad never could. And honestly, first it felt like a fairy tale. Richard wasn't just wealthy, he was rich in that effortless way that some people are. The kind of man who wore $1,000 suits to casual dinners and drove cars that cost more than most people's houses. He owned a chain of luxury hotels across the East Coast, and money seemed to flow from his fingertips like water. Our cramped apartment became a memory as we moved into his sprawling mansion in the hills, complete with a pool, tennis court, and views that stretched for miles. But Richard didn't come alone. He brought Emma, his daughter from his first marriage. Emma was a year older than me, blonde and confident in that way that comes from never having to worry about money. She'd been living with her mother in California, but when Richard got custody, she moved in with us. My mother was thrilled. She'd always wanted me to have a sibling, and here was this ready-made family, gift-wrapped and delivered. Those first few months felt like living in a dream. Richard enrolled me in Westfield Prep, the same elite private school Emma attended. He bought me a car for my 17th birthday, not a fancy one like Emma's BMW, but still a car. He paid for tutoring, SAT prep, even hired a college counselor to help me navigate applications. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I'd found a real father figure. Someone who would love me the way my dad had. But then senior year arrived, and with it came the college acceptances. Emma got into Harvard, her dream school, the place she'd been working toward her entire life. The day that acceptance letter arrived, Richard practically threw a party. He was so proud, calling everyone he knew, posting about it on social media. That night at dinner, he pulled out his checkbook right there at the table and wrote a check for her entire first year's tuition. $60,000. Just like that. No discussion, no hesitation, no concern about the cost. I remember staring at that check, watching him sign it with this satisfied smile on his face. $60,000, written as casually as if he was paying for groceries. Emma was crying happy tears, my mother was beaming, and I felt this weird mix of happiness for Emma and something else I couldn't quite name. Envy, maybe. Or longing. 2 weeks later, my acceptance letter came. Not Harvard, I'd applied but never really expected to get in. Instead, I got into State University, a solid school with a great program in journalism. I was excited, proud even. It wasn't Harvard, but it was mine. I'd worked for it, earned it with my grades and my essays and my determination. I brought the letter to Richard, expecting. I don't know what I expected. Maybe not a $60,000 check, but something. Some acknowledgement, some pride, some celebration. Instead, he glanced at the letter, nodded, and said, "Congratulations, Alex. State school is a good choice for someone in your situation." Someone in my situation. The words hit me like a slap. When I asked what he meant, he explained that I needed to learn responsibility, that I should take out student loans and work part-time to pay my way. It would build character, he said. Make me appreciate my education more. "But you paid for Emma's tuition," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Emma has always been my priority," he replied, not even looking up from his newspaper. "She's my daughter. You understand." That conversation opened my eyes to something I'd been willfully ignoring. The favoritism had always been there, subtle but constant, like background music you don't notice until it stops. Emma got designer clothes for the start of each school year while I got a budget and a trip to the mall. Emma got spring break trips to Cabo and Europe while I got summer jobs to save for college. Emma got a brand new BMW for her 18th birthday, while I got a used Honda that Richard bought from a friend. Every time I brought up the disparity, Richard had an excuse. Emma needed these things because she was going to Harvard, because she had a social position to maintain, because she was his biological daughter and I should understand that family comes first. My mother, bless her heart, always defended him. She'd pull me aside and remind me how lucky we were, how Richard had saved us from financial ruin, how I should be grateful for what I had instead of focusing on what I didn't. But gratitude is a hard thing to maintain when you're working 20 hours a week at a coffee shop just to afford textbooks while your stepsister gets handed everything on a silver platter. It's hard to feel grateful when you're eating ramen for dinner because you spent your last $20 on gas money, while Emma posts Instagram stories from expensive restaurants downtown. The worst part wasn't the money, though. It was the casual way Richard dismissed my achievements while celebrating Emma's. When I made the dean's list my first semester, he nodded and said, "Good job." When Emma got a B+ in organic chemistry, he took her out for a celebratory dinner. When I got an internship at the local newspaper, he barely looked up from his phone. When Emma got accepted to a summer program at Harvard, he called his friends to brag. I started to feel like a ghost in my own home, invisible except when Richard needed someone to do chores or run errands. Emma never had to lift a finger around the house. She was too busy with her studies, too important to waste time on mundane tasks. But I was expected to help with dinner, clean the pool, maintain the landscaping. After all, I needed to learn responsibility. The breaking point came during my sophomore year of college. I was struggling financially, working 2 jobs just to make ends meet, falling behind in my classes because I was too exhausted to study. I swallowed my pride and asked Richard for help. Not a handout, just a small loan to get me through the semester. He listened to my carefully rehearsed speech about my grades and my goals and my promise to pay him back, and then he shook his head. "Alex," he said, "you're 20 years old. It's time you learned to stand on your own 2 feet. Emma is different. She's pursuing a pre-med track at Harvard, and that requires my full support. But you? You're studying journalism at a state school. You don't need my money. You need to learn the value of hard work. That night, I lay in my tiny dorm room, listening to my roommate's loud music through the thin walls, and I felt something inside me break. Not just disappointment or anger, but something deeper. A fundamental shift in how I saw myself, how I saw my place in this family I tried so hard to belong to. I was tired of being the outsider, tired of being treated like the charity case, tired of watching Emma get everything handed to her while I scraped and clawed for every opportunity. But mostly I was tired of pretending that any of this was normal or okay. I had no idea that the truth was so much worse than I imagined. I had no idea that Richard's generosity toward Emma came with strings attached, strings that would strangle everything I thought I knew about my family. I had no idea that the real story was just beginning. It started with little things that didn't quite add up. Late-night phone calls that Richard would take in his study, speaking in hushed tones about payments and arrangements. I'd catch fragments through the door, words like transfer, discretion, and our agreement. When I asked him about it once, he brushed me off, claiming it was just business expenses for Emma's education. But the numbers weren't making sense. Harvard tuition was expensive, sure, but I'd done my research. Even with room and board, books, and living expenses, the cost shouldn't have required the kind of secretive late-night financial discussions Richard was having. And then there were Emma's shopping trips, designer bags that cost more than my monthly rent, jewelry that sparkled with real diamonds, weekend getaways to expensive resorts that she claimed were study breaks. When I asked Emma about it, she'd get this strange look in her eyes, part guilt, part fear. "Richard just wants me to succeed," she'd say, but her voice would shake slightly. "He knows how important my education is." Then she'd change the subject, usually by asking about my own struggles with money, which always made me feel petty for questioning their arrangement. The strangest part was how nervous Richard got whenever I showed interest in Emma's college expenses. He'd installed a new security system on his computer, changed his banking passwords, and started keeping his office door locked. For a man who used to leave his financial documents scattered across his desk, this sudden paranoia felt significant. Everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I'd come home early from work, exhausted from pulling a double shift at the coffee shop. The house was supposed to be empty. Richard was at a business meeting, my mother was at her book club, and Emma was supposed to be at Harvard. But as I walked past Richard's study, I noticed the door was slightly ajar and his computer screen was glowing. I shouldn't have looked. Part of me knows that. But months of watching Emma get everything while I struggled had worn down my moral compass. I needed to understand why I was treated so differently, why Richard's generosity seemed to have such clear boundaries. What I saw on that screen changed everything. Bank transfer records, dozens of them, all going to Emma's account. But these weren't tuition payments. These were monthly transfers of $15,000 every single month for the past 2 years. $30,000 every 2 months. That was more than most people made in a year. And it was just Emma spending money. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the records. The amounts were staggering, but what made my stomach turn were the memo lines. Discretionary expenses. Personal allowance. Special arrangement. I heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly closed the browser, but my mind was racing. This wasn't about education or opportunity or even favoritism. This was something else entirely, something that made me feel sick to think about. I confronted Emma that night. I waited until Richard and my mother were asleep, then knocked softly on her bedroom door. When she opened it, I could see she'd been crying. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she looked smaller somehow, more fragile than I'd ever seen her. "We need to talk," I whispered, and something in my voice must have told her I knew. Her face went completely white. We sat on her bed in the darkness, and I told her what I'd seen. The bank transfers, the amounts, the frequency. I expected her to be defensive, to make excuses, to tell me I was wrong. Instead, she broke down completely. "I can't do this anymore," she sobbed into her hands. "I'm so tired of pretending everything is okay." What came next was the most horrific confession I'd ever heard. Emma told me that Richard had been sexually abusing her since she was 17, just before she started college. It had begun with inappropriate comments and touching, escalated to assault, and had been ongoing for over 2 years. The money, all of it, was payment for her silence. "He said nobody would believe me," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "He said I was just a troubled girl trying to get attention, that I'd destroy the family if I spoke up. And then he started giving me money, saying it was for college, for my future. But it wasn't really for college. It was to keep me quiet." She showed me her phone, scrolling through dozens of text messages from Richard. Messages that made my skin crawl. Inappropriate photos he demanded. Voice recordings of him threatening to cut off all financial support if she ever told anyone. The evidence was overwhelming and sickening. "I wanted to tell your mother," Emma continued. "But Richard said he'd make sure I lost everything. No money for school, no family support, no future. He said he'd ruin my reputation, make sure no one would ever believe me." I felt trapped. The Harvard tuition, the designer clothes, the expensive trips, it was all hush money. Richard had been systematically abusing Emma and buying her silence with cash. The girl I'd resented for having everything handed to her was actually being tortured by the man I'd once looked up to as a father figure. "I've been saving every penny he gives me," Emma said through her tears. "I have almost $200,000 in accounts he doesn't know about. I'm planning to disappear after graduation, go somewhere he can't find me." Sitting there in the darkness, listening to Emma's broken whispers, I realized we were both victims of Richard's manipulation. He'd used money as a weapon against both of us, withholding it from me to teach me responsibility, while forcing it on Emma to purchase her silence about his crimes. Something shifted in me that night. The resentment I'd carried for years evaporated, replaced by a fierce protective instinct I'd never felt before. Emma wasn't my competition or my privileged stepsister, she was my sister, and she was in danger. I looked at her tear-stained face in the moonlight streaming through her window and made a promise. "You're not disappearing," I said firmly. "We're going to make him pay for what he's done." Emma shook her head frantically. "You don't understand, Alex. He's too powerful. He has too much money, too many connections. He'll destroy both of us." "Let him try," I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "But we're not doing this alone, and we're not running away. We're going to gather evidence, build a case, and make sure he never hurts anyone else." Over the next few weeks, Emma and I became co-conspirators. We met in secret, usually late at night in her room or early in the morning before Richard woke up. Emma showed me everything: the threatening texts, the recorded phone calls where Richard's voice dripped with menace, the bank statements showing the pattern of payments that coincided with his escalating demands. But as we dug deeper, we discovered something that made my blood run cold. Richard had done this before. Emma wasn't his first victim. Using his business connections and social media, I found traces of other young women who had worked for his hotels or been involved in his social circles. 3 different women had received similar payments over the past decade, all around the same age Emma had been when the abuse started. "He's a predator," I told Emma one night, showing her the evidence I'd compiled. "This is his pattern. He finds vulnerable young women, usually those who need money for college or starting their careers, and he systematically exploits them. Emma stared at the documents, her face pale. How many others are there that we don't know about? That's exactly why we can't let him get away with this, I said. If we don't stop him now, he'll just find another Emma, another victim who feels like she has no choice. We knew we needed professional help. I researched lawyers who specialized in sexual assault cases and found Sarah Chun, a prosecutor turned private attorney who had a reputation for taking down powerful men who thought their money made them untouchable. When I called her office, I was honest about our situation. We had evidence, we had witnesses, but we were going up against someone with significant resources. Sarah agreed to meet with us on a Saturday morning at her office. Emma was terrified, but I held her hand as we walked into that sterile conference room. Sarah was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened to Emma's story without interruption, occasionally taking notes, her expression growing darker with each detail. "This is a strong case," Sarah said when Emma finished. "The financial records alone establish a clear pattern of coercion and bribery. Combined with the text messages, recordings, and your testimony, we have enough evidence for both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit." "But he's going to fight back," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's going to try to destroy my reputation, claim I'm lying for money." "Let him try," Sarah replied, echoing my words from weeks earlier. Men like Richard Hayes have been getting away with this behavior for decades because their victims were isolated and afraid. But you're not isolated, and you have evidence that speaks for itself. We spent the next hour planning our strategy. Sarah would contact the other victims I'd identified, building a broader case that established Richard's pattern of behavior. We would file criminal charges first, then follow with a civil lawsuit. Most importantly, we would confront Richard together with Sarah present and record everything. "I want him to know that his money can't buy his way out of this," Sarah said. "I want him to understand that his victims aren't powerless anymore." The confrontation was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Sarah would come to the house under the pretense of discussing a business matter with Richard, something about hotel liability insurance. Emma and I would be there, waiting in the living room, ready to face the man who had terrorized us both in different ways. The night before, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the times Richard had made me feel small, worthless, like I didn't deserve the same opportunities as Emma. Now I knew the truth. He'd been protecting his real crime by making me the scapegoat for his favoritism. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood. Richard was in his study, conducting business as usual, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. My mother had gone to her yoga class, giving us the privacy we needed for what was about to happen. When the doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Richard opened the door, greeting Sarah with his usual charming smile, the same smile that had fooled my mother, fooled me, fooled everyone who didn't know what he really was. "Mr. Hayes," Sarah said, her voice professional but cold. "I think we need to have a conversation." Richard's smile faltered slightly as he noticed Emma and me standing in the living room. Something in our posture, our expressions, must have triggered his predatory instincts because his demeanor shifted instantly. The charming businessman facade cracked, revealing something darker underneath. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Sarah walked into the living room, her briefcase in hand, and Richard followed reluctantly. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out what was happening, how much we knew. Emma was trembling beside me, but she held her ground. "We know about the payments," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We know what you've been doing to Emma." Richard's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, denial, then cold fury. I don't know what you think you know, but you're playing with fire here, Alex. Both of you. Are we? Sarah interjected, pulling out a folder from her briefcase. Because I have bank records showing over $600,000 in payments to Emma over the past 2 years. I have text messages where you explicitly threaten to cut off financial support if she speaks up about your sexual advances. I have recordings of you making inappropriate demands. Richard's mask finally slipped completely. You little bitch, he snarled at Emma. After everything I've done for you, after all the money I've given you, this is how you repay me? By giving me money to keep quiet about rape? Emma's voice was shaking but clear. That's not generosity, Richard. That's bribery. Nobody's going to believe you, Richard said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. You're just a troubled girl who's been taking my money for years. I'll tell everyone you seduced me, that you're trying to extort me now. Actually, Sarah said calmly, I think people will believe the evidence, including the 3 other women who have agreed to come forward with similar stories about your behavior. The color drained from Richard's face. Other women? Did you really think Emma was your only victim? I asked. Did you think your money could buy enough silence to cover up a pattern of abuse spanning over a decade? Richard's composure shattered completely. He began pacing the room like a caged animal, his hands shaking. This is insane. You're all insane. I made one mistake, and now you're trying to destroy my entire life. One mistake. Emma stood up, her voice growing stronger. You've been raping me for 2 years, Richard. You've been paying me to stay silent about it. That's not a mistake, that's systematic abuse. I gave you everything. Richard screamed. Harvard, clothes, money, opportunities you never would have had otherwise. You gave me trauma, Emma shot back. You gave me nightmares and panic attacks and the constant fear that someone would find out what you were doing to me. Richard turned to me, his eyes desperate. Alex, you understand, don't you? Family is complicated. Sometimes people make mistakes. But we can work this out. I can help you with college, get you into a better school, give you the same opportunities one gave Emma. The fact that he was trying to bribe me, even now, even after everything had been exposed, showed exactly who Richard really was. My silence isn't for sale, I said. What happened next was like watching a controlled demolition. Sarah had prepared for this moment meticulously, and Richard's threats and admissions during our confrontation had only strengthened our case. Unknown to him, I had been recording everything on my phone, capturing his attempts to bribe me and his angry confessions about the mistakes he'd made. Within hours of leaving our house, Sarah had contacted the police. The financial records, combined with Emma's testimony and the evidence from the other victims, painted a clear picture of systematic abuse and coercion. Richard was arrested that same evening as he sat in his study, probably planning his next move, thinking his money and connections would protect him. But money can't buy innocence when the evidence is overwhelming. The bank transfers alone told the story, hundreds of thousands of dollars moving from his accounts to Emma's, always following the same pattern, always coinciding with his escalating demands. The text messages we'd saved showed his threats in black and white. The recordings captured his voice making demands that no father should ever make. As news of Richard's arrest spread, his carefully constructed world began to crumble. His business partners distanced themselves immediately, not wanting to be associated with someone facing multiple charges of sexual assault and coercion. The board of directors of his hotel chain called an emergency meeting and voted to remove him from all leadership positions. His reputation, built over decades, destroyed in a matter of days. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: his own financial records. During the investigation, prosecutors discovered that Richard had been using company funds to pay his victims. What he thought was his personal money was actually embezzled from his own business. The man who had lectured me about responsibility and learning the value of hard work had been stealing from his own company to fund his crimes. Emma and I watched from the courthouse steps as Richard was led away in handcuffs after his arraignment. The man who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, looked small and broken. His expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he was just another predator who had finally been caught. "How does it feel?" I asked Emma as we watched the news crews pack up their equipment. "Empty," she said quietly. "I thought I'd feel vindicated or happy or something, but mostly I just feel tired." I understood what she meant. Justice doesn't erase trauma. It doesn't give back the years of fear and shame and silence. But it does something else: it validates the truth, it protects future victims, and it proves that money can't buy impunity. 6 months later, Emma transferred to a small liberal arts college in Vermont, far from the shadows of everything that had happened. She chose psychology as her major, wanting to help other survivors find their voices. The money Richard had forced on her, every penny of it, went toward establishing a legal fund for victims of sexual assault who couldn't afford representation. She turned his weapon into a shield for others. My mother and I are still rebuilding our relationship. She was devastated when she learned the truth, consumed with guilt for not seeing the signs, for defending Richard when I complained about the favoritism. But she's in therapy now, and slowly we're learning to be a family again. Just the two of us, the way it was before Richard inserted himself into our lives. As for me, I finished my degree in journalism, graduated with honors, and got a job at a newspaper covering criminal justice. Emma's courage in speaking up inspired me to use my voice to tell the stories of people who've been silenced by those in power. Every article I write is a small act of resistance against the idea that money can buy silence. The other victims came forward during the trial, and their testimonies painted a picture of a man who had been systematically abusing his power for over a decade. Richard was sentenced to 15 years in prison, his business empire dissolved, his personal fortune seized to pay restitution to his victims. The man who once bragged that money could buy anything died in prison 3 years later, alone and forgotten. But Emma and I? We're still here. We're still fighting. We're still proving that some things, dignity, truth, justice, will never be for sale. I think about that night Emma broke down in her bedroom, when she was planning to disappear after graduation, to spend her life running from the truth. Instead, she found the courage to stand up to her abuser, and in doing so she saved not just herself, but countless future victims who will never know Richard's name because his victims found their voices. The tuition money Richard thought would buy Emma's silence actually funded her liberation. The favoritism I resented became the evidence that brought him down. The very system he created to control us became the tool of his destruction. Richard learned that some things truly can't be bought: integrity, justice, and the courage to speak truth to power. If this story moved you, please like and share to help others find the courage to speak up. Subscribe for more stories about justice prevailing over abuse of power. Sometimes the most expensive lesson someone can learn is that money can't buy everything, especially someone's silence when it matters most. And sometimes the very thing an abuser uses to control their victim becomes the key to their own downfall.